You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, here from New York City.
And this is Prashant Paramaswaran from Washington, D.C.
How are you doing today, Prashant? Good to see you.
Good. How are you doing?
Doing well, doing well. For listeners, we're going to divide this episode into two parts like we used to do in the early days of the podcast. We haven't been doing that recently, but I think there's enough that merits discussion on today's episode that I think this will be a good approach. And I guess the unifying theme of the two things we're going to talk about is Southeast Asia and the shifting military landscape around the Southeast Asian littoral, broadly speaking. So the first thing we're going to talk about on today's episode is this very interesting report that appeared just a few days ago on Monday, July 22nd in the Wall Street Journal, detailing a secret agreement between China and Cambodia for a naval outpost. Now, if you've been reading The Diplomat and you've been following the Cambodia-China relationship, there have been rumors of this and pretty credible reports, some people doing work with satellite imagery. So this isn't necessarily surprising, but a lot of the details in the report I think are interesting. So we'll talk a bit about that. And then Prashant and I want to pivot over slightly towards the east, where we'll talk about the still ongoing standoff between Vietnam and China over oil exploration on Vietnam's continental shelf in waters that China also claims. So we'll talk a little bit about those two things today. But Prashant, obviously, this is, I'm excited to have you on for this episode, given that you follow all of these countries very closely. I wanted to begin with your sort of reaction to the Wall Street Journal report on the Cambodian naval base. So do you want to maybe begin by just telling listeners that might have missed the story what the broad takeaway is, and then we can maybe talk a little bit about the significance?
Sure. I think this, as you said, it's an important development not only for its own sake, but also within the context of China's influence and ongoing activities in Southeast Asia more generally. So the Wall Street Journal article that you referred to that came out during the weekend, essentially what was breaking about it and what was new was the fact that there had been a secret agreement that were reached between China and Cambodia with respect to a facility on Ream Naval Base. And this is a base that lies on the coast of the Gulf of Thailand, so a pretty strategic area. And it's been previously used as a site of exercises and engagements between the United States and Cambodia. And the idea that was advanced in the article, which we should stress, it's all anonymously sourced given the sensitivity of the information, but the Wall Street Journal claims that it's read some of the exchanges between the United States and also between China and Cambodia on these agreements. It's for exclusive Chinese access to part of that base for up to 30 years and renewable thereafter. And will allow the Chinese to put in significant amounts of personnel and facilities. And this was essentially we've talked about previously on this podcast, right? The idea of China getting more places rather than bases for its location, whether you consider facilities like Djibouti or facilities like Gwadar. This would be its first essential base or facility in Southeast Asia of this kind, which is why it's quite significant.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, we're having this discussion right, I guess, one day before China is supposed to release its 2019 white paper on national defense. And when the 2015 white paper came out, one of the main emphases was the more global expeditionary mission for the PLA, working towards becoming a global maritime power. And we then saw the base pop up in Djibouti. So this will be the second base overall. Many of these other facilities that have been under scrutiny for a while, including Gwadar, Hambantota, remain unmilitarized. So they're not officially becoming bases. But in Cambodia, there's a few things that are of concern. There's the facility that's being built on the coast near the Ream naval base that Cambodia uses, and then there's the nearby airstrip and the airport. So one of the things that Americans are worried about, but specifically, and this is an important detail, I think, in the Wall Street Journal report that I think a few people muddled a little when talking about the issue, which was that the agreement that the Journal's reporters saw was about the naval base and what China could put on that facility, as you said. But the airstrip nearby, that's a major concern, because if China were to have an airstrip in Cambodia, that has important implications for its ability to then use that facility for support, logistics, resupply, and even strike missions in a conflict in the South China Sea and the Gulf of Thailand.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a really important point to emphasize. So even though the bulk of the journalist reporting is on the naval base, there have been separate concerns, but of course related concerns about these facilities or potential facilities that are dual use that are being built around the area or nearby with respect to Kokong. And the reason why that's significant is, the Chinese have claimed, as they've claimed in other aspects of dual use facilities, that this is totally economic and it's tied to this investment zone called Dara Sakor
Hmm.
with respect to the Belt and Road Initiative. But as you correctly noted, there are clear military implications that would arise if the Chinese were to use this for security purposes. And all the estimates that I've seen are the fact that any economic investment opportunity in this area, when you compare that to what is actually being built with respect to satellite imagery, it's not enough to support any kind of civilian or economic opportunity in and of itself. So clearly there's something else that's going on, irrespective of whether you want to call it a base or a dual use facility or what have you. So clearly something fishy is going on
Hmm.
between the naval base as well as this other facility that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk a bit about sort of the leading indicators that we've had that this was coming, right? So we had the reports last year that Mike Pence had written Hun Sen a report saying that we're concerned about the base that the Chinese are building on your territory, and that was a briefly lived news cycle. It didn't get huge, except for those of us who follow Asian security kind of talked about it a little bit. But then more broadly, going back further, I mean, just Hun Sen's relationship with China and Xi Jinping, in the Xi Jinping era specifically, I think we've had a lot of indications that Cambodia is very much putting all of its eggs in the China basket for a while now. And I want to ask you, because I know you look at Cambodia a lot more closely than I do in general. What other indicators do you think were in place, kind of pointing to this outcome?
I think the big one, particularly from the perspective of the United States, was the fact that you had this notion of increasing Chinese influence in Cambodia, but a few years ago, the Chinese began to make significant military inroads there in terms of new exercises, really pushing on military equipment. China's always been Cambodia's sort of number one military partner and provider in the last few decades, particularly under Hun Sen's rule. But it really was pushing on that. And at the same time, the Cambodians actually reneged on several of the existing pledges they had with respect to military assistance with the United States. And I think at that point, the United States sort of thinking that, well, China's influence in Cambodia actually comes at the expense of U.S. influence in Cambodia. And you saw, the cancellation of U.S. exercises that happened in Cambodia right before the recent general elections that took place. You saw, the suspension of military linkages. And at that point, I think the United States in particular was quite concerned about whether this was kind of a point of no return. I think the other thing I would cite as well is, we're talking about this from the perspective of, U.S., China, and Cambodia and U.S., China competition in Southeast Asia. This also has implications for other neighboring states, right? We're going to be talking about Vietnam later. The Vietnamese and the Thais would also be concerned about, growing Chinese military inroads in Cambodia. These are two powers that have wanted, significant, significant attention and sort of significant influence in mainland Southeast Asia. So this is something that not only affects the balance of power when you think about the United States and China, it also affects how mainland Southeast Asian countries react with each other. And I think in the last few years, the Chinese inroads in Cambodia have also alarmed both Thailand and Vietnam independently as well.
Right. I mean, this very much, I actually wanted to ask you about this, is that this cuts at one of the core principles of ASEAN, right? And I think the grouping, if and when this base is sort of publicly announced, if that's ever going to happen, I think that's really going to pose a further challenge for the grouping. And obviously, this is all happening while ASEAN's still in negotiations over the finalization of the code of conduct with China in the South China Sea. And Cambodia has obviously been an important sort of ally for China within the ASEAN arrangement for several years now. So I think that's absolutely a valid point. Another thing I wanted to get your thoughts on is it's interesting because we are going to run into this issue that China is going to go around the world and begin converting dual use facilities into whatever you want to call it, bases or logistics supply nodes, as the Chinese like to call the Djibouti facility somewhat euphemistically. But one of the arguments that the United States has put forward to many of these smaller countries in the Indo-Pacific is that part of the reason you should support a free and open Indo-Pacific is because we want to maximize your sovereignty to help you undertake the choices that you do. And I feel like it's interesting because, Cambodia is not Sri Lanka, it's not Pakistan, it's not Malaysia in many ways, where you have this narrative of China coming in and taking advantage of whatever government happens to be in power with predatory loans, projects that don't really make sense. In the Cambodian sense, it really seems like a sovereign decision to opt into a security sphere in continental Southeast Asia where China has a greater sense of influence. So I'm wondering if that message is sort of going up against these active U.S. efforts now to lobby Hun Sen to reverse course on allowing China to undertake development. But it's sort of a partially formed idea. So I'm curious if you have anything to say on that.
It is, I think, a big question and concern, right? Because I think sometimes when you look at the rhetoric that is coming out in the conversation that between this sort of notion of U.S.-China competition, whether it's on Belt and Road or the military sphere, the impression that's been giving out is, there's a focus on what the Chinese are doing in these areas and sort of, China is pushing this, it's pushing predatory loans. But, what if you have a situation where these countries are actually willing to buy into this bargain that the Chinese are striking, which is that, hey, listen, we'll give you increasing, economic trade and investment. We won't ask questions about regime legitimacy, and we're offering you a better bargain than what Western countries can offer you. And countries like Cambodia might be willing to actually take that on, even if they are actually quite conscious of the costs that are actually involved, right? And I think it's important to stress here that regime security may not be the same as national security. So when the United States and other sort of allies and partners make this argument that, hey, Cambodia, you're not looking out for your national interests. Well, you have a regime in Cambodia and Hun Sen that is actually willing to put its own interests first. And so if China props up that regime, I'm not surprised that regime would consider it in its interest to kind of move forward on this, right? And so that does create an issue for the United States and allies and partners. I think, the argument that's been made with some of these facilities is, for example, the Wall Street Journal talked about the fact that this alleged secret agreement, has some of these terms that strike observers as, pretty concerning, right? The fact that you have an agreement for a base for up to 30 years, there's exclusive Chinese access. Do the Cambodians know what they're actually doing? But the fact that the United States has raised these concerns multiple times, right? And the Cambodian government is well aware of what these concerns are. It doesn't strike me as this is something that the Cambodians are going into uninitiated. I think they're very aware of what conditions are being sought by the Chinese, and I think they're willingly entering into this agreement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, so let's shift gears briefly. We'll come back to the Cambodia issue, I'm sure, in a future episode when more information does become available on that front. But I wanted to briefly address this standoff that's quite significant and still underway between Vietnam and China. So for listeners, for over the course of a few weeks now, I'm not really exactly sure when things started, but it has been a matter of weeks, despite the fact that it was publicized a little over a week ago. A Chinese survey ship has been conducting sort of exploration activities in an oil block on Vietnam's continental shelf within the exclusive economic zone. And under UNCLOS, the international law concerning rights to these waters and waters worldwide, coastal states like Vietnam presumably have the exclusive rights to economically exploit those resources. But of course, here we're entering the classic sort of South China Sea dispute issue where China treats those waters as its sovereign territory under its 9-dash line claims. So we have a problem. We have this Chinese survey ship accompanied by a China Coast Guard, now at least 2 ships, including the Haijing 3901, which is one of the largest Coast Guard vessels anywhere in the world. It's a rather massive ship. And the Chinese have really been involved in directly coercing Vietnam, including the Vietnam Coast Guard, away from these oil blocks. So the issue here is that China is exercising its capabilities and its maritime law enforcement capabilities in particular to coerce a South China Sea coastal state from rightfully exploiting resources that should be its own under international law. And we have a few other examples in recent years of this kind of activity. We can go back to the 2014 standoff between Vietnam and China. That was really sort of a watershed moment for the relationship between the two countries insofar as their South China Sea dispute was concerned. That was the year that in May, China moved the Haiyang-Qiu 981 oil drilling platform into disputed waters, sparking a major standoff involving scores of ships on both sides, including maritime militia vessels. So this has been ongoing, and what's been interesting is that the United States State Department took more of an interest in this than it has in some other recent issues in the South China Sea, putting out a statement condemning China for its bullying behavior and its practice of coercion against Vietnam. As we're recording this, there's been a little bit of a lull in the data coming out. The Vietnamese Foreign Ministry released a statement calling on China to exit its waters, but with the exclusion of the fact that an additional China Coast Guard vessel has reportedly moved near the survey ship to protect its activities, there's been little update on what exactly is transpiring on the water. There's been a lot of good work done on the details of the movements of many of these vessels by the CSIS Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative in particular, and a few other sources. So Prashant, looking at the ongoing standoff, How do you see the two sides getting out of this? Or is this really going to be the moment when China simply carries on pushing forward and Vietnam really finds itself having very few options apart from what it's already done, which is publicly condemn the action and call on the Chinese to leave?
Yeah, it as you said, I mean, it all boils down to the fact that, at the end of the day, we're dealing with, a set of disputes that, in spite of the fact that we've had, and we should point out this, we're coming just after the third anniversary of the arbitral tribunal ruling, right, on the South China Sea, which, even though in 2016 and 2017 was talked about quite a lot, that ruling has essentially been, continues to be violated by China, that is continuing to exercise what it regards as its 9-dash line, which is essentially being operationalized, and a number of other claimant states that actually disagree with China's notion of what its rights are and what its territory actually is. And so, until you get a resolution on that, it's very difficult, for me to see some kind of definitive resolution to this issue. I would also say it does seem that the Chinese are trying to and are getting more comfortable with, what I think some Chinese have referred to as sort of the new normal in the South China Sea, right? Where you do have some freedom of navigation operations carried out by the United States, some presence operations by other partners that are occurring. But in spite of that, China has had no issues with periodically coercing other claimants in the South China Sea, intercepting some of its, oil and gas exploration efforts, and making clear to individual claimants that there are certain kinds of behaviors that China won't tolerate, and it's prepared to actually escalate things. And if there are tensions and potential conflict, China is actually willing to bear the costs of these actions in order to make sure that it enforces what it sees as its rightful claims. As you pointed out, I think one of the interesting variables in this is the United States and its approach to the South China Sea. We definitely have seen the Trump administration speak out more fervently on these issues, including resource issues, which was not the case a few years ago. But I do wonder, and be interested to hear your thoughts on this. We are sort of still in this continuing situation where I do feel that, other regional partners are sort of looking to the United States to say, well, if the Chinese continue to violate these provisions and these laws and principles that you've talked about, the United States is really the only country that's going to be able to actually counter China, given its vast asymmetry of capabilities relative to Southeast Asian states. The only question is the United States willing to do that? And my impression is we don't have a resolution on that question yet under the Trump administration, even though the rhetoric is a lot more strident, right?
Yeah, I mean, one example of that would be, and this is something I don't think is going to happen at all, would be, U.S. naval assets accompanying Vietnamese survey ships in these oil blocks, right? That would be a huge step. Vietnam's not even a treaty ally. So that would just be a huge step. It's not U.S. policy. The way the United States asserts its interest in the South China Sea and freedom of navigation is through operations where the United States unilaterally protests excessive maritime claims. But that's what makes this State Department statement kind of interesting, right? Because previously, it was freedom of navigation that would get the United States to put statements out and to push back on this kind of coercive Chinese activity. But this time, it's supporting the right of a coastal state in the South China Sea to have access to its exclusive resources. And, of course, I don't want to open up another can of worms here, Prashant, but I think part of what's made this a little bit difficult for Washington to kind of stand up for the ability of these states to rightfully exploit these resources is the posture of a country like the Philippines, right? I mean, you just brought up the fact that it's the third anniversary of the arbitral tribunal's ruling, but under Duterte, obviously, the Philippine government's position or willingness to really stick its neck out when China conducts activities in the Philippines continental shelf or exclusive economic zone, especially after the arbitral tribunal in 2016 actually decided on several important questions relating to the extent of the Philippines' exclusive economic zone and continental shelf. The fact that Duterte is unwilling to stand up makes it, again, very difficult for the United States, which isn't physically in the region, right, with territory, to then kind of come into the area and then stand up for these rights. And that's what China continues to say, is that the United States really should keep out of this because we'll handle this on a bilateral basis with Southeast Asian states. And that, I think, is what poses the biggest problem for a country like Vietnam, which really does want to have that ballast behind it to help it protect its own rights in the South China Sea.
No, absolutely. The United States, as the Chinese are always keen to point out, it isn't a claimant in the South China Sea, even though it claims to support some of the claimants, and the Philippines, as you said, is a treaty ally of the United States. So there is that fact. But Duterte just this week, in his State of the Nation address, directly mentioned, China is doing these actions in the South China Sea. Can anyone really stop China from doing it? Which is inherently questions what other countries, including the United States, can do to actually stop what the Chinese are working on. I will say, this is something which I hope that these tensions get resolved, and I hope that 2020 perhaps will be a calmer year. But the fact that the Vietnamese are chairing ASEAN next year, and the fact that the Chinese have said that they want a code of conduct, whatever the value of that code of conduct is, a binding code of conduct, to be negotiated in the next few years, means that they're going to be in the hot seat next year in ASEAN amid all these other developments, including, Cambodia's ongoing, softening of its position on the South China Sea, which has affected ASEAN unity. So the Vietnamese will have, I suspect, a lot on their plate next year.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I think we're out of time, so we'll leave it there. But I definitely want to come back to some of these issues. I think we're actually overdue for an episode on the Philippines again, so that might be interesting to go back to on a future episode. But,
sounds good.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for joining me, Prashant.
Good to be with you.
Great. And for listeners, before we close, I do want to include our usual sponsor note. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics Podcast was brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia-Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risks. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. As always, thanks a lot for listening to the episode. If you like what you heard and you want to keep up with future episodes, make sure you hit subscribe. You can do that on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or any other number of podcast providers out there. And finally, if you've been listening for a while and you like what you hear, I'd really love it if you could leave us a review on any one of those platforms. It really helps get the word out about the show. So thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back next week with more.